Hi guys, welcome back to CRYPTID'S Den. There are some stories that don't just pass through us, they stay. They sit quietly in the corners of our minds, reminding us of the choices we made or didn't make. Tonight's story is one of those. As I prepared it, I found myself reflecting on regret, on missed chances, on the kind of pain we don't always talk about out loud. It touched something personal in me, and maybe it will in you too. If you're watching, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, and if this story speaks to you in any way, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. Your presence here truly means more than I can say. Now, let's get into it. Would you believe that a 76-year-old man, living alone in a frozen forest cabin, found a reason to live again? Because of a strange, heartbreaking cry in the middle of a snowstorm? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was a dying baby Bigfoot, curled up in the wreck of an abandoned truck. And the only one who dared to save it was the very man who had spent his whole life cutting down the forest it came from. This is based on the true journal entries of Walter Grady, a reclusive ex-lumberjack hidden deep in Colorado's San Juan mountains. In this story, you'll discover how a wild creature helped heal a broken human soul, why unconditional love can transcend species, and the real reason a small town began to believe in the legend of the Silent Timberfolk. Walter had given up on life, until Briar, the creature he rescued, returned one last time to save him. Not a myth, a moment of truth. If you've ever felt lost, forgotten, or too old to matter, don't skip this video. Just 5 minutes could restore your belief in wild, impossible grace. Timberline Hollow hadn't seen this kind of snow in years. By the end of the second night, the town was no longer a town. It was a hush, a ghost wrapped in white. Everything slowed. Even the wind didn't howl anymore. It cried, just a soft, drawn-out wail across the tops of the frozen pines, as if the mountains themselves were mourning something no one remembered. Walter Grady sat alone in the cabin. Not a new silence to him, just deeper now. The kind that doesn't come from quiet, but from absence. The kind that fills your ears like cotton when you realize nobody's coming anymore. The old man moved slowly in his kitchen, a mug in one hand, the other bracing the edge of the counter. The wood stove crackled in the corner. Its fire cast long shadows up the pine walls, dancing across the dust-covered frames. Helen's photo sat beside a weathered leather journal and a busted old radio that hadn't worked since the Carter administration. Her smile, still soft, still sure, watched him from the table. 2 years, and the dust still refused to settle on her face. He made sure of that. He poured the boiling water into the tin pot, folded in the grounds, stirred with the back of the spoon. The same ritual, same hour, same 2 mugs. Only now, one stayed empty. Outside, the snow was 2.5 feet deep, maybe more near the tree line. The whole world had gone white. Even the breath of the forest animals had been swallowed up. Everything muffled. Still, but the wind kept weeping. He sipped his coffee. It burned, just enough to remind him he was still here. He stared through the window, the glass fogged at the edges. Beyond it, the woods slept under ice. Not dead, just dreaming. Then he heard it. It didn't belong to the wind. A sound so thin, so small, it might have been missed entirely. But something in it, some cracked, desperate edge, cut through the quiet. A cry, not quite animal, not quite human either. Sharp and high, but choking on something like panic. Not a howl, not a whimper. Like a child lost in a storm with no name to call out. Walter froze. He turned his head, angling his ear toward the sound again. Nothing. He stepped toward the front door, set down the mug, and wrapped his coat tight around his chest. It took effort. Everything did lately. His hands found the old oil lantern hanging by the doorway. He struck the match, flame, flicker. His shadow leapt behind him, and for a moment he looked like a younger man. Then it was gone. The door opened with a long groan. The cold slapped him, sharp and honest. He stepped into it. Snow swallowed his boots past the ankle. The storm had passed, but the sky still sagged low. Heavy clouds pressed down like a warning, the kind you can feel in your teeth. He followed the faint sound. It didn't return, but something in him moved anyway. Muscle memory. A rhythm carved from 4 decades in the forest. A ranger's instinct. You don't always need to hear the call twice. The lantern bobbed in his hand, casting halos through the fog. His breath came in sharp bursts. The trail led him to a slope near the old logging road, abandoned since '62. That's when the mill shut down and the men left. The forest had been eating it back ever since. Then he saw it. Buried in a snowdrift like a coffin stood the rusted corpse of a logging truck, its cabin crooked. One tire ripped from the axle, windshield long gone. He'd forgotten it was still here, and wedged against the passenger side, half submerged in ice and slush, was something moving. He raised the lantern. A figure. Small, curled in on itself, covered in muck and clumped snow and what looked like fur. He blinked, stepped closer. It was alive, breathing, barely. One limb twitched. Walter lowered himself, ignoring the stab in his knees. His hands reached forward, brushing the ice from its back. The fur was soaked through. Beneath it, skin. Not rough like a bear's, but soft and too thin for this kind of cold. Its face was pressed into its arm, barely visible. But the eye, just one, opened for a split second. That was all it took. It looked straight into him. Not through him, into him. Something ancient, something scared. He pressed his hand to the door of the truck cabin. It wouldn't budge. Frozen solid. The seams caked in solid ice. He stood and kicked. Once, twice, nothing. Then he pulled the hatchet from the loop on his coat. He hadn't used it in months. The blade bit down. Splinters flew. On the 4th swing, the door cracked and fell open with a groan of rust. He wrapped his arms around the creature. Its weight was less than he expected. Maybe 40 pounds. Soaked, trembling, nearly limp. Not a cub, not a child, not anything he could name in that moment. But not something you leave behind. The snow swallowed their footprints as he carried it back. The lantern light swung in rhythm with each step. Behind them, the truck faded into the white again, as if none of it had ever happened. But Walter knew better. The weight in his arms was real. Back at the cabin, he kicked the door closed behind him. The wind howled, just for a second. Then it was gone again. He laid the creature near the stove, on top of an old quilt Helen had sewn years ago. The heat from the fire curled around them both. He stripped off the wet fur. Layer by layer, the shape beneath it became clearer. Hands, fingers, with nails curved just slightly at the ends. Not claws, but not quite human either. It stirred. He grabbed a towel and dried the fur as best he could. He pulled the sheepskin coat from the hook by the stairs, Helen's old winter wear, and draped it gently across the small frame. It didn't resist. Walter crouched beside it, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with age. He poured broth into a tin cup, took a spoon, and slowly tilted a drop into the side of the creature's mouth. It swallowed. He exhaled. Alive. It was alive. He sat back, arms on his knees, watching the firelight ripple across the fur. The eye fluttered open again, watery, exhausted, but still watching. He didn't speak. Not yet. There wasn't a word good enough for this moment. Instead, he nodded once and muttered quietly, almost to himself. "All right then, buddy. You're safe now." The eye closed. Outside, the storm had passed. But in that quiet, the forest wasn't done speaking. Not yet. And neither was whatever he had just brought home. The wind had died down, but the cold hadn't. It settled into the wood, the nails, the bones of the cabin itself. The kind of chill that stayed quiet, like it was listening. Walter stirred the fire until it spit little sparks into the dark. Then he added more logs, one at a time, slow and steady. The creature lay nearby, wrapped in Helen's sheepskin coat. curled into a soft mound just beyond the glow. It hadn't moved in over an hour. That both comforted and unnerved him. He crouched, watching the breath rise faintly from its nostrils. Not rapid, not labored. Just enough. He didn't know what it was, but it sure as hell wasn't a bear. The hands had fingers. The palms had curves like human ones do. The fur was different, softer near the face, thicker down the spine. And the eyes. No animal he'd known ever looked at him that way. Still, it hadn't spoken, hadn't growled or hissed or tried to run. It just let itself be there. Walter poured some soup from the pot into a tin mug. It was thick. Venison, carrots, potatoes. Leftovers from a couple nights ago. He let it cool a moment, then grabbed the old silver spoon. Helen's favorite one. The one with the nick near the handle from that time he dropped it splitting wood and she laughed for 20 minutes straight. He eased down beside the creature and gently lifted its chin. The head was heavy, still wet from the snowmelt. He tipped the spoon to its lips. A drop rolled down. It blinked. Then again. Swallowed. Not much, but enough to try again. He kept going. Slow, patient. He didn't speak. Not yet. Words felt too heavy. By the 5th spoonful, it opened its eyes. Both, this time. One was swollen a bit, probably from the cold, but the other held. Deep, brown, glassy, but aware. Not darting like prey. Not dead either, just watching. Walter sat back. He exhaled into his hands and rubbed them together. His joints ached from the cold, and from years, and maybe something else. He looked over at the photo still sitting on the table. I don't know what I brought home, he muttered softly, almost ashamed. But I couldn't leave it out there. You'd have killed me for even thinking about it. The creature shifted, just a twitch, like it heard. He scratched his beard and stood. He moved slowly now, not because of fear, but out of some kind of reverence. Like he didn't want to wake a dream. That night, he didn't sleep in the loft. He pulled the old armchair closer to the stove, tossed a quilt over his knees, and let the fire do its work. Every now and then, he'd glance sideways at the bundle on the floor. Still breathing. Still there. Morning came behind a veil of frost. The window panes were fogged with ice, delicate veins crawling inward. Walter stood and stretched. His knees popped like they always did. The coffee took longer to brew than usual. Maybe it was the silence again, or maybe it was the weight of something unspoken in the room. He set a mug on the table, then poured a second and placed it beside the creature, still wrapped in Helen's coat, eyes now open, watching him from the floor. Don't suppose you like coffee, he said, half smiling. But it's all we've got before noon around here. It didn't respond, didn't blink, just looked. He took a sip from his own cup and lowered himself beside it again. I'm gonna call you Buddy just till I figure out what you really are. Sound good? Still nothing, but the eyes didn't turn away. You're lucky, he muttered, shaking his head. Back in the day, we'd have shot first and sent samples to the lab later. God, we cut down half these mountains before anyone thought twice about it. He stared into the fire. All for lumber, all for profit. No one asked what lived here first. He trailed off. The fire crackled. The creature blinked slowly, then let out the softest sound. Not a cry, not a growl, just air. A breath that felt almost tired. Walter sat back. He reached over and picked up the leather-bound journal from the shelf. The spine cracked like dry skin. He hadn't opened it in over a year. Not since Helen. He flipped past the pages of sketches and clippings, old trail maps, letters he never sent. Then paused. There, tucked between the pages, was one of her poems. Handwritten. Ink slightly smudged. He stared at it for a long time, then cleared his throat. This was her favorite, he said, voice a little rough. She used to read it to me on the porch when the air got that golden look in September. He began to read. His voice trembled at first, then steadied, carried by the rhythm of something sacred. The words drifted out into the room, weaving between the shadows like smoke. The poem spoke of trees and time, and how the earth remembers what men forget. How things lost can sometimes return, not as they were, but as they were meant to be. When he finished, he looked over. The creature hadn't moved, but its shoulders, those hunched, trembling shoulders, had relaxed. Just a little. Walter leaned closer. He could see the curve of its jaw now, the way the light played across its fur. The hand resting by its side looked almost human. 5 fingers. Nails curved, not like claws. The pads dark and worn. Not a bear, not a wolf, not anything in his ranger's guidebook. It was something else. Something old. He rose slowly and stepped outside to get air. The cold hit him in the lungs again, sharp as truth. He looked out across the white. The trees stood still. No tracks, no sign of anything else. Just his own footsteps, already half gone. He stood there a while, thinking, then went back inside. By the 3rd day, the creature could sit up. It didn't eat much, just broth, bits of meat. Always slow, always watching. Walter began talking more. About the forest. About the time he almost lost a toe in the flood of '78. About the loggers who used to drink at Rosie's before it burned down. About Helen and how she made him plant a tree for everyone he cut. "First time I held a sapling," he said, "I thought it was a joke. Now I've got 24 that outgrew the house." He chuckled. The creature blinked. He kept going. "I wasn't always like this," he said. "I had plans. We were going to build a rescue center, take in hurt animals, even talked about getting a hawk." The stove crackled. "She died before we got that far." He didn't look at the creature as he said it. Just let the words hang. Then, finally, it moved. Not much. Just lifted its hand, slowly, gently, placed it on the floor between them. Walter looked down. He reached forward and set his palm on the floor too, right beside it, not touching but close enough. And for a second, the room didn't feel so empty. That night, as he tucked the blanket around it again, he saw it looking at the fire. Not scared, not weak, just still, like it was thinking. He whispered, "You've been through something." It didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The fire crackled louder. The wind picked up outside, not angry this time, just passing through. And somewhere deep in that forest, something was listening back. Snow still blanketed the ground outside, though it had hardened into a thick crust. The storm had passed days ago, but the cold stayed behind like an unwanted guest, quiet and persistent. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low. It had burned all night, casting soft light across the wooden floor. Shadows swayed on the walls like memories trying to speak. Walter moved slowly through the kitchen, setting a pan on the stove, pouring water in from the jug beside the counter. His body ached in the way it always did when the temperature dropped below freezing. He didn't complain. Just let the heat from the stove crawl into his hands, while the rest of him stayed still. Behind him, the floor creaked. He turned. The creature, Buddy, as he still called it, was standing. Not tall, not yet steady, but upright. Its long arms hung at its sides, fingers relaxed. The eyes were open, searching the room with slow precision, as if mapping out a place it hadn't decided to trust yet. Walter didn't move. Buddy took a step forward, then another. The footfalls were heavier than expected, deep, padded but careful. It didn't stumble, it didn't freeze. It simply moved. Walter took a slow breath. "Morning," he said gently. Buddy blinked once. Its head tilted slightly. Then, as if mimicking something ancient, it walked toward the chair by the fire and sat. Not dropped or collapsed, sat. Walter turned back to the stove, poured coffee, made 2 mugs again, same as every morning. He set one on the table. The other stayed beside the stove. For a long time, neither of them spoke. And then, without any fanfare, Buddy reached for a tin cup on the table and held it, awkwardly, like a child might imitate a parent. Walter didn't react, didn't praise or correct, just watched. The movement was strange, not because of the hand itself, but because of how human the attempt was. Too smooth for an animal. Too uncertain for a person. Later that day, Walter sat at the table, reading an old article he'd clipped about the last of the Ute elders who used to live near the mountain basin. The page had yellowed, corners curled, ink fading. Helen used to read them out loud while they both sipped whiskey and stared at the trees. She always said the mountain held stories older than any book. Buddy circled the cabin slowly. It wasn't pacing. It wasn't fear. It was observation. The way it moved, head turning, nostrils flaring gently, fingers brushing the window's edge. It felt like watching someone trying to remember something they'd never learned. Walter turned a page. He didn't realize he'd dozed off until the sharp crash hit the room like a gunshot. His eyes flew open. Buddy stood frozen near the counter, one hand halfway to its side. Shards of ceramic lay scattered on the floor, a pale white cup in pieces. The morning light caught the glaze on the broken handle, and Walter's heart caught in his throat. That was Helen's, the white ceramic mug. The one she'd sipped from every single morning for 36 years. No chips, no cracks, just simple, solid, steady. Gone now. He stood fast. The chair scraped hard against the wood. Buddy recoiled. Not out of guilt, out of instinct. The eyes widened. The shoulders rose. The arms drew close to the chest. Walter's voice came louder than he meant it. Not a scream, but deep, sharp. "What the hell?" He stopped himself. The rest of the sentence withered in his mouth. The cabin went still. The fire popped once, but it felt like an aftershock. Buddy's chest heaved once, twice. The hands trembled, not in fear of pain, but in that quiet, raw confusion that comes when a wall you didn't know existed suddenly slams shut. Walter stared at the shards on the floor. He didn't bend down, didn't say anything, just stared, breath shaking. Then, slowly, he stepped backward. He dropped into the chair. The wood groaned beneath him. His hand came up, covering his face. No tears, just pressure. The kind that builds behind the eyes when something deep breaks loose. It wasn't the mug. It was what it meant. Helen's last things. There weren't many. A few clothes, some photos, a hairbrush, her old cookbook with oil stains on the cover, and that mug, that stupid little white mug. He used to hold it like it was her hand, just to remember the weight. He sighed. Not loud, just enough to shift the air. But he hadn't moved. Still standing by the counter, arms still drawn in, shoulders still tight. Walter lowered his hand. His eyes found the creature's. There was no malice there, no defiance, just uncertainty, as if waiting for a verdict it didn't understand. He stood again, slower this time, stepped forward, knelt beside the shattered cup. He picked up one piece at a time, fingers careful, hands shaking. Then he stood, walked to the sink, and set the shards down gently. Behind him there was a sound, barely more than a breath. He turned. Buddy had stepped closer, one arm extended. The hand, those long, strange fingers, reached forward and rested lightly on Walter's shoulder. Not rough, not demanding, just present. Walter didn't move. He let it rest there, just for a second. Then he reached up and gently placed his own hand on top of it. For a moment, nothing was broken. Not really. That night, neither of them said a word. Walter sat in the armchair, journal open on his lap, pen unmoving. Buddy lay curled near the fire, but closer now. Not across the room like before, within reach. The firelight caught in the curve of its brow, the line of its jaw, the way the fur thinned just slightly around the eyes. Walter stared for a long time. Eventually, he set the pen down and closed the book. Some things didn't need to be written. Some things just needed to be remembered. And as the wind whispered across the cabin roof again, he knew the silence had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. By late January, Timberline Hollow had started whispering again. Not through letters or landlines, but in the way small towns always do. Behind curtains, over fences, through breath that fogged up diner windows and never quite reached the point. Stories slipped through like smoke. They always found a way. It started when a boy named Charlie Raymond, barely 10, swore he saw something by the tree line. Said it was tall, covered in hair, moved like a person but hunched like a bear. His mom laughed it off. His dad told him to quit fibbing. But the next day, 2 more kids said the same thing, this time near the old quarry. Then a pair of hikers mentioned strange footprints along the creek bed. Too wide, too deep, too clean. The name came back fast. Not spoken in years, but it never really died. Silent Timberfolk. The Ute elders used to say they were keepers of the land, walkers between the fog. Not beasts, not men, just watchers, ancient, quiet, sacred. Now folks whispered it again like a prayer they didn't believe in anymore, but couldn't quite forget. At the center of all of it, the old man's cabin sat in its usual hush, buried beneath another week of snowfall, chimney breathing steady smoke into the sky. Inside, Walter stirred stew on the stove while Buddy, no longer feverish, no longer trembling, paced near the back door. Taller now, not in inches, but in presence. The fur had dried to a soft charcoal gray. The eyes followed everything, every movement, every sound. Not out of fear, out of study. Like it understood the cabin, the man, the world they shared, and was trying to remember something older than both. Walter had noticed changes. In the way Buddy stood longer in the dark before stepping into the light. In how it avoided the mirror by the stairs. In how it pressed one hand to the wooden wall some nights like it was listening through the grain. They had a rhythm now. Breakfast, silence, work, fire, sleep. Until headlights cut through it. 3 of them. Walter spotted them first from the kitchen window. Bright against the snow, piercing through dusk like needles. Old trucks. One had a bumper sticker peeling off. Another had a rack of rifles mounted in the bed. Walter didn't curse. He just stood still. Buddy crouched low instinctively, muscles tensing beneath the fur. Walter turned slowly and reached out a hand. "Stay," he whispered. "Stay right here." The knock came before he reached the door. 3 men stood outside, their faces red from the cold. Eyes narrowed more from suspicion than wind. "Evenin', Walt," said the tallest. A man named Reggie Burnham. Used to hunt elk in season, now mostly hunted anything with teeth. "You hear the stories?" he asked without waiting. "I hear a lot of things," Walter replied, not opening the door all the way. "There's talk of something big in the woods. Couple of kids say they saw it. Some hikers, too. Thought you might have noticed anything out your way." Walter didn't blink. "Just deer and wind." Reggie smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we take a walk around?" Walter's jaw tightened. "Private land." "We're just looking. If there's a bear, it might be dangerous." "It's winter. Bears are sleeping." Reggie's hand rested on the strap of his flashlight. The second man, Pete, younger, meaner, spat into the snow. "Funny thing," he said. "None of the tracks look like bear. Not unless they started walking upright." Walter finally stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. The air between them dropped. "You boys want to waste your night chasing shadows. That's your business. But there's nothing here that needs shooting. You come back with a warrant or a badge, we'll talk different." Pete shifted his weight. The third man, silent, glanced toward the trees. Then Reggie tipped his hat. "Just trying to keep Timberline safe." Walter nodded. "Then you should start with the drunks at Miller's and leave the woods alone." They left slow, didn't speak. But Walter watched them go, eyes following every tire track until the snow began swallowing them whole. Inside, Buddy hadn't moved, still crouched, still silent. But something had changed. That night, long after the fire had died to a whisper, Walter heard it. A sound low and guttural, buried in the back of the throat. Not a growl, not a threat. Something deeper. It rose up and vibrated through the floorboards. He looked up. Buddy stood by the door, eyes wide, head tilted toward the distant woods. Then, from beyond the cabin came another sound. Faint, barely audible. Not a howl, not footsteps. Something strange. An echo of footsteps with no weight. A breath without lungs. Walter reached slowly for the lantern, lit it with shaking hands, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow had settled deep, and then it happened. A scream. Not sharp, not human. A wail rolled out from somewhere down the slope. Long, low, wounded. Not pain. Warning. It shook the trees. It made the wind flinch. And behind him, Buddy let out a sound he'd never heard before. Not fear, not rage, but something ancestral. The kind of sound carved into the bones of mountains. He turned and saw Buddy standing tall, shoulders square, chest heaving. The fire behind it threw wild light across its face, eyes glowing like riverbed amber. It wasn't hiding anymore. Walter didn't speak. He didn't need to. He watched as Buddy stepped forward into the doorway, nostrils flaring. Another sound came from deeper in the woods, distant, frantic. Then silence. Walter held his breath. The snow outside stayed still, but he knew it wouldn't last. The forest was stirring again. Something was waking. And now, they weren't the only ones watching. The snow began to thin as February rolled in. Still cold, still biting in the mornings, but the weight of it started lifting from the pine boughs. The sun came through more often, though weak and slanted, like it was trying to remember how to warm the earth again. And with it came something quieter, something Walter felt more than understood. An ending, not all at once, just in the way the cabin creaked differently, in the way Buddy started to stir before him in the mornings, gaze fixed out the window longer, body taut, listening to something Walter couldn't hear. It had been weeks since the scream in the woods, since the night the men with guns came knocking. And though no one else had returned, Walter knew that kind of curiosity didn't just die. It lingered, it simmered, and eventually, it circled back. So, he did what he'd always done when time thinned around the edges. He taught. It began in small pieces. He brought Buddy out back, boots crunching over old snow, and pointed to the stream that curved behind the ridge. The edges were still iced, but water ran beneath. Walter knelt, peeled moss from the northern side of a birch, held it up. "See this?" he said, holding it to the pale sun. "Grows on the north side, always does. You ever get turned around, find the moss, and you'll find your way." Buddy crouched beside him, head tilted. Not just watching, studying. The next day, Walter cracked a pair of old black walnuts against a flat stone and showed how to separate the bitter shell from the meat inside. Buddy tried next. It took 2 strikes. On the third, the nut cracked clean, and he let out a breath through his nose like a laugh that hadn't figured out it was allowed yet. Day after that, Walter laid out small tools on the table. Flint, cord, a simple blade. He ran his hands over each like prayer beads, then wrapped them carefully in canvas and handed them to Buddy without saying a word. Buddy took them gently, held them as if they meant something beyond what they were. And each night by the fire, Walter told stories. He talked about Helen again, about how she'd make him sit in silence for an hour before felling any tree. "We take nothing that doesn't feed us," she'd say. "And even then, ask first." He talked about the flood that nearly drowned the Eastern Trail, how he built the bridge that still stood there today with just rope and luck, how he once pulled a hunter out of a ravine with a busted leg and no thanks. He told Buddy all of it. Not because he thought it needed remembering, but because it felt like Buddy already knew some version of it, like he was putting the pieces back in the right order. And sometimes, when Walter spoke about things that hurt, about loss, about war, about the trees they tore down without asking, Buddy would inch closer, never touching, but closer, like warmth choosing to stay. But Walter knew it couldn't last. He felt it in the way Buddy's shoulders shifted when the wind carried a new smell, in how the creature pressed its ear to the frozen earth and went still for long stretches of time, in the way it started sleeping less and walking longer loops around the cabin. It was listening to something calling from farther away than Walter could reach. So, one morning, before the sun fully broke the ridge, Walter reached up to the mantel. His fingers brushed a wooden pendant, carved from red cedar, smoothed over years. A small spiral pattern burned into its center, Helen's favorite shape. She once said it reminded her of growth, of things returning to themselves, even after being lost. He held it in his hand, feeling its warmth. Then he turned and walked to where Buddy stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the horizon. Walter didn't say anything, just reached out, took Buddy's hand gently, and pressed the pendant into the furred palm. Buddy looked down, then up. The creature's eyes, still wild, still unreadable, locked with his. But this time, there was something behind them. Something open, like a door not quite closed. Walter gave a nod, and the creature curled its fingers around the gift. That night, when the fire dimmed and the wind rose again through the trees, Walter woke to stillness. Too still. He sat up. The sheepskin lay folded neatly by the hearth. The tools were gone. So was Buddy. He stepped outside without his coat. Just stood there, breathing steam into the cold. The forest stretched out in front of him, wide and waiting. At first, he thought Buddy had just gone deeper into the woods. But then he saw it. Right there on the porch, nestled beside the doorway, lay a single branch, pine, snapped in half and laid side by side, forming a rough arrow pointing north. Walter stared at it a long time, then nodded once. It wasn't a goodbye, not exactly. More like a promise. The kind that didn't need words. He stepped back inside, sat down in his chair, closed his eyes. The fire popped once, sending a small crackle into the dark, and from somewhere out there, the forest sighed in response. The forest held its breath again, not from snow or storm, but from the stillness that follows parting. A quiet so sharp it left an ache in the ribs. Walter felt it everywhere, in the empty mug across the table, in the folded sheepskin by the hearth, in the weight of the pendant no longer on the mantel. Days passed, maybe 4, maybe more. Time no longer ticked in hours or calendars, but in absence. He didn't call out, didn't search, just waited, because some things don't return the same way they leave. He'd gone out that morning for firewood. The kindling pile was low, and the cold had crept back in with early March. The snow had softened into wet patches that soaked through his boots, but he didn't complain. His coat was too thin, but he refused to wear the heavier one. That had been Helen's favorite, and it didn't feel right anymore. He walked the ridge trail, the one that curved south along the slope where the pines leaned against each other like tired elders. His axe swung at his side, dull from age, but still enough for dry limbs. The silence followed him. So did the cold. And something else. Something he didn't name. He found a downed tree near the bend and knelt to check the grain. Good wood, dry enough to split. He reached for the handle of the axe and swung once. The sound cracked through the woods like a cough. He pulled again and swung, once, twice, 3 times. Then everything went quiet again. He straightened, stretched his back, and that's when he heard it. Not a rustle, not a crunch. A shift, heavy, too fast for snowdrift, too silent for deer. He turned, slow. Nothing. The trees stood still, but his gut tensed. He moved carefully, gathering what he'd cut, stacking logs in his arms. The wind rose, just a little, and with it, something in the air changed. He didn't see the movement. He felt it, a prickle at the back of the neck, a weight behind his shoulder. He turned fully this time, and there it was, not 20 feet away, a mountain lion, low to the ground, tail flicking, ears flat. Gold eyes locked onto him like twin coals under frost. It had been tracking him. He didn't breathe, didn't blink. He dropped one log by accident, and the thump startled the cat just enough to shift its paws forward. Walter knew better than to run. He raised his axe, steady hands, slow breath. His fingers wrapped the handle like they were 20 years younger. The cat hissed. Teeth flashed. Then it sprang. He didn't scream. Didn't even shout. He swung the axe up, caught the air, and the weight of the lion slammed into his chest like a truck. They fell. The snow cushioned nothing. He hit the ground hard. The cat's claws scraped his jacket, tore through cloth, nicked skin. His hand scrabbled for a branch. Anything. The axe had flung free. He caught a broken limb, swung it up as the lion bared its teeth, mouth wide. The blow didn't stop it, just made it mad. Walter rolled. Snow shoved into his lungs. The beast came again. Then, before he could lift the branch again, something exploded from the tree line. A blur, fur, muscle, sound. A deep, guttural roar that didn't belong to man or mountain. The lion twisted. Too late. The weight of a body slammed into it, hurling both into the trees. Walter gasped. His vision tilted. Branches snapped. Snow fell in chunks. He tried to stand, but pain ran through his ribs like wire. Then, through the trees, he saw it. Briar. Not Buddy. Not anymore. Bigger. Stronger. The fur gleamed silver gray, thick and matted with pine needles. Shoulders broad. Eyes wild. But still familiar. They wrestled. The lion struck, claws flashing, but Briar didn't flinch. Teeth sank into the cat's flank. They rolled through the brush, snarls cutting the silence. Blood sprayed against the bark. Walter pulled himself to his knees. The lion broke free and turned, limping, whimpering, then bolted into the trees, tail low, gone like smoke. Briar staggered forward, chest heaving, blood dripping from his side. Walter shouted, "Briar!" The creature turned, and in that moment, despite the blood, the snarl, the wild hair and torn skin, Walter saw it. The same eyes, the same soul. Briar stumbled, dropped to one knee, then crawled toward him. Walter caught him halfway, arms wide. He didn't think about the blood or the smell or the weight. He just held him the way you hold a lost child returned in the dark. He whispered the name again. Briar. The name Helen had whispered once in a dream. The name he'd kept in the back of his throat all winter. Briar blinked, rested his head against Walter's chest. They stayed like that a long time. No more sounds. Just heartbeats and wind. By dusk, they'd made it back to the cabin. Walter carried as much as he could, dragging the sled behind him. Briar limped beside him, not asking for help, but accepting the closeness. Inside, the fire was lit. Walter wrapped Briar's wounds with what was left of the clean bandages, tore a sheet from an old flannel shirt, fed him broth by the spoon, wiped his brow like he used to for Helen during her worst days. Briar didn't resist, didn't hide, just breathed. Walter sat beside him as the flames danced. He didn't ask where he'd been, didn't need to. Briar was back, and that was enough, for now. But Walter knew better than to think this was the end of it, because something had chased Briar out of hiding. And it wasn't just hunger. He felt it again, in the wind, in the trees. The mountain was shifting. Something old had stirred, and it wasn't done yet. The pain didn't hit Walter until the second day, that deep, bone-throbbing kind. The kind you can't stretch or sleep away. It moved through his ribs like rust, slow and aching, and every breath felt like chewing ice. But he didn't say a word. Not to himself, not to the wind, and certainly not to Briar. The creature slept by the hearth, curled but alert. Even in rest, its ears twitched at every creak. The fire warmed the fur along its shoulders, and the faint rise and fall of its chest made the room feel less empty. Walter watched him from the rocker, one arm across his ribs, the other still holding the flannel blanket Helen had sewn decades back. It smelled like pine smoke and old time. He wasn't sure if it kept the cold out or just gave his hands something to hold. They didn't speak. They never had. But something between them had shifted since the mountain lion. It wasn't just gratitude or trust. It was older than that. Maybe it was the silence they now shared. The kind that only comes when both have seen the same thing and survived it. For 3 days they stayed inside. Snow had fallen again, but thinner this time, soft like ash. Outside, the forest murmured. Not loud, but restless. Birds had returned to the lower branches, their wings cutting shadows against the cabin wall. Walter listened to them while he stirred soup, fingers stiff, breath short. Each night the fire died slower, and each morning Briar's wounds closed more. By the 4th day, he rose and stepped outside. Didn't wait for Walter, just opened the door with one long arm, and moved into the pale light like he was returning to something unfinished. Walter watched from the window. Briar didn't go far. Just stood in the clearing, head tilted, arms loose at his sides, like he was listening for something the trees hadn't yet said. That afternoon, Walter found him kneeling by the stream. The ice had broken away in parts, and water moved again, low and dark and sure. Briar dipped his fingers in and held still for a long time. Later, when they sat together beneath the old pine that leaned over the cabin's rear slope, Walter finally spoke. "You're leaving soon," he said. Briar didn't answer. "Didn't have to?" Walter leaned back against the bark. The cold of it pressed through his shirt, but he let it. Made him feel clearer somehow. "You've been different since you came back," he said. "Not worse, just not small anymore." Briar blinked. Wind caught the fur at his shoulders, made it shift like grass in shallow water. Walter drew in a breath, slow and careful. "I always thought if you came back, I'd ask you what you were, where you came from. Why me?" He looked down. "But now, I think maybe it don't matter." Briar turned his head. The eyes weren't wild. They were tired. And something else, tender. "I'm glad you made it," Walter said. "And I'm glad I was here." That night, neither of them ate much. The fire burned low, casting long shadows against the ceiling beams. Walter sat in his chair with the old photo album on his lap. He hadn't opened it since Helen passed. The leather cracked when he touched the spine. Dust lifted like breath from old lungs. Inside, pictures of another life. Helen laughing with her boots in the river. A younger Walter holding up a trout like it was gold. A crooked fence he built by hand and never got quite straight. And at the back, an envelope, tucked in tight. He opened it. Inside, a note in Helen's looping script. "If you ever find something you can't explain, don't run. Sit with it. Listen. Some things come back when we make space for them." Walter stared at it for a long time, then folded it again, slipped it into the journal. In the early hours, before dawn touched the snow, he woke to quiet. Too quiet. He sat up. The fire was out. The chair by the door was empty. So was the cabin. He moved slowly, letting the cold bite his feet, letting the truth settle before it had to speak. He opened the door and paused. No tracks in the snow. But by the edge of the porch, near the split pine log he used for firewood, a shape stood out. A small, smooth stone, balanced perfectly atop a bundle of pine needles, bent into a gentle arc. Walter stepped forward. Kneeling hurt more than he expected. He grunted, picked up the stone, and turned it in his palm. Nothing special. Just weight. Just warmth, barely. He set it back down. The forest didn't speak, didn't shift, but Walter looked to the ridge, just as the first streak of pale gold cut through the clouds. And he smiled. Not wide. Not for show. Just enough. Later that day, he walked down to the stream. The water moved again, slow, clear, cutting through the thaw. He stood there a long while, letting the wind run through his coat, letting the silence curl around his shoulders like a blanket. He looked across the water, where the trees thickened, and though he saw nothing, his chest felt full, not with words, with something better. He turned back toward the cabin. Didn't speak, didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't require a voice. They just ask that you be brave enough to notice when the silence changes. Fall came slow that year, not with fanfare, not with sharp winds or bursts of orange fire, just a slow letting go. The trees yellowed like they were remembering something sweet and old. The creek narrowed to a soft trickle. The air had that kind of stillness that wrapped around you instead of pushing you away. Walter Grady sat by the cabin steps, elbows on his knees, hat resting in his lap. His breath wasn't what it used to be. Neither were his knees, but his eyes. They stayed sharp, clear, steady, like the lake on the west side after a windless night. He didn't get around much anymore. Didn't need to. The forest came to him now. In the morning, birds nesting closer. In the way the foxes didn't run when he passed. In the way the trees seemed to lean inward, like they'd begun to recognize him. It had been 6 months since he'd seen Briar. Not a sound, not a footprint, not a trace. But that morning he'd woken different. Didn't know why. Didn't need to. He'd made coffee the same as always. Sat at the table with the journal open, pen resting on the edge. It had been weeks since he'd written in it. Not because there was nothing left to say, just because some things didn't want to be pinned down anymore. Now the sun was low and long, casting gold across the pines. The last of the fireweed curled in on itself, and the moss had darkened near the rocks by the creek. He stood, slow, breath catching in his chest, and walked the old path that curved along the stream bed. The trail was still there, not because it had been cleared, but because he walked it enough that it remembered him. The air smelled like dried cedar and riverstone. He crossed the shallow water at the bend near the hill, stepped up onto the other side. Then he stopped. On the far bank, beneath a stand of aspens just starting to blush gold, stood a figure, tall, broader than before, fur like dusk and smoke, thicker now, heavier, Briar, and he wasn't alone. Beside him, another figure, shorter, leaner, fur tinged with auburn, and flanking them both, two small shapes, moving gently, still clumsy, still learning their legs, but steady. A family. Walter didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, heart doing something it hadn't done in a while. Briar looked at him, held the gaze, long enough for the wind to pass between them like a slow tide. Then, quietly, gently, Briar gave a single nod. Not a bow, not a goodbye, a recognition. Walter let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd held, and nodded back. He didn't wave, didn't call, just turned, slow, and walked the path back to the cabin. The sound of the stream kept pace beside him, soft and steady like a heartbeat. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars blinked through the open skylight, Walter sat by the wood stove, hands wrapped around a warm mug. He didn't read, didn't write, just listened. To the crackle of flame, to the creak of the beams, to the breath of a forest older than memory. Later that week, he began building the food stations. Just small platforms at first. Wooden shelves beneath the cover of pine, places to leave dried berries, nuts, fish wrapped in cloth. He mapped them by the natural trails, the ones he knew and the ones he'd only just begun to feel. And at each one, he placed a mark. A smooth stone, a piece of carved cedar. Nothing that would scare a hiker, but enough for the right eyes to see. He didn't tell anyone. Didn't have to. But word got around anyway. Kids from town started showing up on Saturdays. First one, then 3, then 5. They asked him about trees, about tracks, about what mushrooms were safe and which weren't. He didn't lie, but he didn't give away everything either. Some stories aren't yours to tell. He taught them to listen, not just hear, but listen. And when he saw them standing still by the creek, watching the water without needing to ask what it meant, he knew the work had begun. One night near the end of October, he wrote in the journal again. Not a full page, just a single line. We don't keep the forest. The forest keeps us. Love set free always finds its way back. He closed the journal, set it down, went outside. The moon was rising over the ridge, wide and low and full of stories. Somewhere beyond the trees, a shape moved, slow, deliberate, unseen. He didn't chase it. Didn't need to. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, breath hanging like fog, and listened to the quiet that wasn't empty anymore. Inside the cabin, the fire hummed. The kettle whistled once and fell quiet, and the mountain, wrapped in dusk and pine and memory, stood watch, not over what was lost, but over what had finally been found. Some stories aren't meant to be understood right away. They unfold the way forests grow, slow, quiet, often in places no one's looking. They don't shout their meaning. They don't demand attention. They just wait. And if you're lucky enough to stumble across one, all you have to do is stay still and listen. This wasn't a story about monsters or miracles. It wasn't about what's real in the scientific sense, or what can be proven with photographs or footprints. It was about something deeper. The kind of truth that lives between silence and memory. The kind that changes a person not all at once, but little by little. Like how sunlight fades winter from the trees, or how kindness settles into someone's bones after years of being alone. Sometimes what saves us isn't a cure, or a hero, or even a second chance. Sometimes it's the choice to open the door when something strange knocks, to offer warmth when the world has gone cold, to see past what frightens us, and care anyway. There are places still untouched by time, places where the old stories breathe through moss and river stones, where the wind carries more than just weather. In those places, if you're quiet, you might feel something watching, not out of malice, but out of memory. Because kindness echoes, and so does love, and so does loss. We are all, in some way, caretakers of what we don't fully understand. So plant what you can, build what you can, leave behind something softer than the world gave you, because even if no one sees it happen, even if the world never says thank you, something does. And one day when you're not expecting it, something might come back, not because it owed you anything, but because it remembered. If this story touched something in you, if it made you feel seen or quieted something loud inside, please consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Your reflections help keep stories like this alive. And if you'd like to walk with me again into the wild unknown, don't forget to subscribe and follow the channel. There's always another trail to walk, another voice waiting to be heard. Thank you truly for listening.